Welcome to Comptroller's Corner. I'm your host, Pat Curry, joined as always by Buffalo Comptroller Mark Schroeder. Our top story today, the year-end financials are being issued this week for the city, and the news is not good for the city's bottom line. $35 million in reserves are being needed to close the city's budget gap. Now those reserves are dwindling. Mark, last year the unassigned fund balance, which is the only category of reserves that can be used to balance a budget, was at $42 million. Now it's at $6 million, and the margin for error is very small for the city as far as balancing its budget in the near future.
Yeah, it's very concerning. I'm certain that the mayor and his commissioner of finance is also concerned about this. When they budgeted $10 million, but then at the end of the day used $34 million out of a reserve or out of the savings account, just so people understand what's happening here, it is very, very concerning. It gets a little bit more complicated because over the years, we have had very intimate conversations with the rating agencies, and the rating agencies has asked me as the fiscal officer certain questions, and the questions have to do what's in the overall general fund. And so the news that you started out with, Patrick, of suggesting that the city is using $35 million, what happens if you look at the whole general fund and all of the things that are within there? At the end of the day, it comes below $100 million. And there is also a policy within the city of Buffalo that takes them below their own policy that we've set. So it is a very concerning time for us right now, and so that's why we're ringing the bell and letting the administration and also the council members and others know that not only were we aware of it now, we've been aware of it because we've responded in the budget response, and also we've responded in what is called quarterly gap responses, where we're clear about what's happening, different than what they said in the beginning of the budget process.
Now, you mentioned the budget response. That was back in May when you warned that there could be a $28 million fund balance draw to balance the budget. It turned out to be a lot worse than that. You warned again in July when you did, as you mentioned, the gap response. So this is a trend for the city. They've been using reserves to balance a structurally imbalanced budget for years and years and years. In fact, we thought it was hitting a high point when it was over $26 million a few years ago, but now we see that $35 million was the highest in recent memory that's ever been needed to balance the budget. That can be concerning not just for the rating agencies, but for the city being able to meet its obligations when it doesn't have a pile of reserves sitting there and it's dwindling down. How are you going to make that budget balance?
Yeah, it's very concerning, and that if you look closely at expenditures versus revenues, coming into the city of Buffalo coffers. It is very troubling, and so therefore certain things have to be done, and this is where the policymakers come in. The policymakers being the mayor, the policymakers being the 9 council members, and I have heard from certain council members who are now very concerned about this. And they're asking some questions, and so we're going to invite them in and we'll go over much of this. But Patrick, as you pointed out, we have been ringing the bell in writing, over the last year, and especially starting in May, and then through each and every quarter in writing, and we submit it and we file it. It's a public record within the city clerk's office, and all council members get it. So really nobody should be surprised. But there are certain things that they may be able to come up with. There are certain spending situations where they're going to have to curtail, and these are things that are all within their jurisdiction.
Now, you mentioned spending. $35 million needed in reserves. That's pretty much exactly how much the city spent in overtime last year. So you think with better managing of the city's time as far as overtime, that could mitigate some of this budget nonsense that we've had to endure as far as dwindling our reserves. And that's where you really got to take this by the horns, is going after expenses, because revenues have been flat and we don't see an increase in them coming anytime soon. So a good place to look would be the $35 million in overtime expenses that the city incurred last year.
Patrick, it's a good point, but even the outside consultants that we hire, CPA firm that comes in, they have said to us, and they've said it in writing in their management letter, that this is something that happens constantly. This goes on every year. Every year there is overtime within fire and police to the number that you're talking about each and every year, and nothing ever seems to change. So now it's becoming very, very concerning to me. The reason, why something like this happens, and the council members and the mayor and the administration, may not be aware of it, is because in good times, and when certain things happen, certain benefits come from New York State, and maybe there's just a little blemish that you put a little Clarisil on and it all goes away. But now this is like a wart developing, and it's a problem, and it needs to be addressed right away. If it's addressed right away, we're going to be okay. If it's not addressed right away, this is the reason why 15 years ago or so we went the way of the control board, because government and the policymakers were out of control and they didn't take responsibility for expenditures, revenues, using the taxpayer savings account to balance the budget, to make it seem like everything's just going great, but it's not. And so something needs to be done, and this is where the mayor and the council are going to have to go to work.
Now, you mentioned the control board. In fact, in your May budget response, you said that the ramifications of depleting the city's reserves includes credit rating downgrades, higher interest rates for borrowing, cash flow shortages, insolvency, and ultimately the return of the hard control board. Now, after all this progress the city's made, it would be a shame if the control board were to come back, if the city's bonds were to be junk status, if we're paying more in interest than we should. So we need to address this issue now rather than waiting for the inevitable.
Over the course of the last 6 years that I've been the Buffalo City Comptroller, I've had some, conversations with the mayor, and the mayor has asked me about the process of, getting an upgrade. And, Patrick, we have earned 3 upgrades over the last 5 years. That's a record for the city of Buffalo. And we've also earned the highest rating in Buffalo history a year ago or so, AA-, which is outstanding. So rather than tell the mayor how we would go about trying to get an upgrade, I always remind him how we can get a downgrade. And all of the things that you've talked about so far are the things that I tell the mayor. And I also tell the mayor in that very nebulous legislation that was created in around 2000, 2001 or so, that created a control board. There are certain clauses within that legislation that if the city is unable to do, that means the control board goes hard. That means the control board, in essence, runs the city. And that is something that I think is misguided. There are enough elected officials in city government that have a responsibility to run the government, and we should not have a control board running it. So the city, the mayor, and the council members, they've got some work to do right now.
Now, this budget is also troubled by the fact that the solid waste fund continues to have a deficit, operating deficit, despite the fact that the city subsidizes that solid waste fund at least $3.2 million every year, and often on top of that $3.2 million, we have to give even more money to the solid waste fund because they're operating at a deficit. Now, their deficit, despite despite the city giving them $27 million in recent years, their deficit is still $18 million that they owe taxpayers. So the general fund continues to subsidize this money-losing operation in the solid waste fund, and you're not sure that it can continue to do that. In fact, it might have to be eliminated and folded back into the general fund if it's not going to be the self-sufficient fund that it was intended to be.
Yeah, and so, you know, just to be fair to this mayor, this procedure, this standard that has been created within the city of Buffalo predates this mayor. It doesn't make it right, though. Let me just point that out. It doesn't make it right. We need to figure out a way to make this right. The mayor and his team, they negotiate with contractors who come in to do the solid waste and to do the certain things here, and that there's always a gap every year that the mayor has to sweep money from an enterprise fund into the general fund, and it's been going on for about 20 years at about $3 million a year. Last year was worse at 5.2. And so it is a problem that has to really be resolved. And so when the outside auditors, when they bring it up again, now we've brought this up. When we first became the comptroller 6 years ago, we published this several times wherever we could, including the budget response. So it's not like, this is the first time they're hearing it from us. And so now I'm even more concerned because there's all sorts of problems that are going on around us too that has bailed out the city over the last several years, and I know we're going to be talking about some of those topics coming up.
Yeah, including it seems like the parking fund also bails out the city on a yearly basis. There was a $9 million transfer. That's money that should be going to improve parking ramps in the city. Meanwhile, instead, the city's borrowing money to improve those parking ramps, incurring unnecessary interest costs.
Yeah, at their insistence, because we've pointed out to them that exactly what you just said, within the parking enterprise fund, there are surpluses that they could reinvest in the city parking lots, but they don't. They want to go to the market, and if they want, they're the policymakers, that's what we do. And then they take the surplus and they put it somewhere else. And so that is something that we are now going to seriously look into, and we're going to ask probably for a ruling, or to see if there's some case law that could prevent the city from doing this in the future. It's coming to that point now, Patrick.
One other area where the city is falling short now is casino revenue. We're not getting that from the Senecas because of this impasse with New York State. The current budget this year that it's in is budgeted for. So next year, when we're sitting here talking about the year-end financials, that could be even worse if the casino revenue doesn't come in. And the casino revenue is right around what's left in the unassigned fund balance, so the city could be really up against a wall next year when we're sitting here.
Around $5 to $7 million.
Correct.
Yeah. So I mean, and again, it isn't like this is the first time this has ever happened. This has happened before. There are disputes between the Seneca Nation and the state government, the governor in particular, and so there is now again. And what happens is that the city of Buffalo will actually, be injured by this because of all the other things that we're talking about as well. So it's the perfect storm that you don't want, financial storm that's kind of hitting Buffalo right now.
All right, Mark, we got to take a brief break. When I get back, I want to talk a little bit about the capital budget.
Okay.
Stay tuned for more Comptroller's Corner after this message.
Oh, hey, mister. Studied algebra in school and got a better job than I could. You take the last
Oh,
couple.
no, mister. Stuck in an entry-level job because you only learned basic math. I don't have a boss riding my butt like you do, so you take it so you can get back to your desk.
You know, I probably should, but maybe Miss AP Calculus with the $200 haircut in the big office upstairs would like a cup.
Oh, no, Mr. What was your name again? Never mind, it doesn't matter. I'm too busy doing important things to care. I just came down for some sweet and start.
You know, if my limited math abilities weren't keeping me from getting a better job, I'd quit this afternoon.
I don't blame you. But thank goodness you're stuck here because we really need someone to make the coffee.
Line it up, baby. Come on. Line it up, baby. Come on. Line it up, baby.
Hi, welcome back to Comptroller's Corner. Every year the city goes to the marketplace to sell bonds to fund its capital projects. Now, Mark Schroeder, the comptroller, is warning that excessive debt can hurt the city, especially with the tight finances that the city has just unveiled in their year-end financials. Now, Mark, you warn every year about borrowing too much, and it seems to cause some conflict with people that want to borrow more than really the city can afford. Just this year, Mr. Adam Perry, who's the chairman of the Citizens Planning Council, in a letter said that he admonished you to increase the amount of the city's debt cap. Now, you were just wondering why Mr. Perry didn't admonish the mayor for not including more general fund money in the capital budget. Now, many municipalities use general fund money to fund some of their capital budgets, Rochester included. The city does zero from their capital, $450 million operating budget. So not only are they not using any general fund money to fund this capital budget, which is so sorely needed, as Mr. Perry contends, but also the mayor has been shifting the burden of recurring expenses. Now, routine repair and maintenance, tree trimming, demolitions. Now, these are things the city does every year. Not only are they not really capital improvements, you're not building anything with this, but if we're incurring these expenses year after year after year, it doesn't really make any sense to incur interest expenses on this. It just makes it more expensive to tear down a house, more expensive to trim a tree, or do routine repair and maintenance. So what you're saying is that, first off, the city should be not using the capital budget for these routine year in, year out expenses, and they also should be using some more capital funds to ensure that the city's not wasting money on unnecessary interest expenses, especially with finances as tight as they're going to be in the next few years.
Sure. So I'm not the only one who has said this. In fact, it was a previous comptroller in the 1940s who then left the comptroller's office and then became the budget finance director for a mayor. And that was the time where the city decided that they weren't just going to depend on going to the bond market, that they were going to invest also, from the treasury, from the general fund. That has been a practice that has not been adopted by this mayor and or this council. It's problematic, and when you have a lawyer, Adam Perry, telling the comptroller separately elected, what I should be doing, that's laughable to me. In all due respect, it's laughable because, quite frankly, I just haven't operated the same way as other previous comptrollers who always did the same thing every year, and the administration was delighted. They would borrow $27 million every year. I don't do it that way, and I won't do it that way. I am not going to the bond market unless there's empirical evidence from the administration that they can spend the money in an appropriate way, and so that keeps us out of the way of the IRS and other things that I have responsibilities for. Also, what I think is very concerning that Mr. Perry ought to be aware of, he ought to be aware of his surroundings, of what's happening in our state. When the state comptroller says that we, New York State, and our municipalities, there's a triple threat going on, Mr. Perry ought to be aware of that. What does the state comptroller mean when he says a triple threat? Well, here's what he means, Mr. Perry. He means that there is a budget deficit of $4.2 billion, that's with the B, that the state is projecting. And in the out years, it gets worse to $6 billion and $8.2 billion. So that's one threat. The other threat is if Mr. Perry was aware and understood that on the New York State tax collection, they're down 2.1%. Oh, it doesn't sound so bad, but it's $800 million. problematic. Then, this so-called reform tax package offered by the President of the United States of America and the Republican Congress and Senate is not only disastrous to individuals, middle-class individuals especially, but I'll leave that to Congressman Brian Higgins, who's done a very good job in explaining why that reform package is awful for Buffalo and for New York State. But let me just suggest to Mr. Perry and to others, in this legislation, they take out the ability for us, Audit and Control, the Comptroller, to do what is called advanced refundings. We've made a living of doing advanced refundings that benefit the Buffalo Public Schools to $100 million to them. We're going to be unable to do that if this is signed off by the President of the United States. So this is problematic. So when I've said that controllers every year they go to the market for $27 million, $22 million is for the city. I don't do that. And for the school district, it's $5 million. Since I've been controller for 6 years, I've not gone to the market for the school district, not one time, not once. Why? Because of the refunding opportunities that we've taken advantage of. Now we're going to be unable to do it if these bills, both passed by the Senate and the Assembly, Senate and the Congress, when they go to conference. And if it's agreed on and the president signs off on it, Buffalo is doomed by $12.8 million starting January in terms of this great program that's going to be so great for all of us. It's not going to be.
One thing you pointed out to Mr. Perry in your letter is that since the debt service is funded directly through property tax revenue, if the city incurs too much debt and in turn debt service, that could lead directly, it could force the city to raise taxes on our taxpayers, and we have to do it. So Mr. Perry doesn't really, he wanted him to know the gravity of what he's asking for. He could be asking for a big tax hike for citizens at home.
Well, I'm certain that Mr. Perry didn't write the letter. Somebody within the mayor's office did, so maybe they should be asking themselves that same question. But to ask right now, every year we hear this from them, from Mr. Perry and from Mr. Kelly and from others. But this year, you would think they really would be aware of their surroundings. You think they would be aware of this so-called tax reform package that's out there. You would think they would be aware that year after year after year, over the last 6 years, the state has bailed out the city of Buffalo with state aid and with funding. And this year, I doubt that's going to happen. This is problematic. Listen, I'm very candid. I'm always candid. But now the mayor has entered into his fourth term. And that is usually trouble for four-term mayors. It's only happened once before. Jimmy Griffin had 13 years in a row of surplus budgets. And then in his 14th year, there was a deficit of $25 million and some indictments of his commissioners. So this is where we are. This is where we're heading right now. So we need to be reform-minded, and we need to understand that we have to do, the city has to do better, the policymakers have to do better. They got to roll up their sleeves now, and they have to do everything they can to prevent a control board from coming in and taking over.
Now, you hear from Mr. Perry and others that, well, rates are low right now, even though they've been low for quite some time. Rates are low right now. We should borrow, borrow, borrow. But you liken it to a household budget. Now, if your household budget, your income is not quite meeting your expenses and you're dipping into your reserves every year to balance your budget, and all of a sudden somebody offers you a credit card with a great rate, are you going to max out that credit card even though your income's not going up?
Yeah.
No, it's just going to cause more problems for you down the line. Regardless of how low the rates are, we're still going to be paying for this, and we're still going to be paying interest on it.
Yeah.
So it's a better idea, rather than max out the city's credit card, really the taxpayer's credit card, on something you might not be able to afford. That could hurt you down the line, especially with the city's finances getting tighter and tighter and there's less reserves available.
Yeah.
Now's not the time to be maxing out the city's credit card.
Yeah, and over the last 6 years, even in the first 3 or 4 years I was the controller, it was better times financially for the city of Buffalo. But still, the fine print with the rating agencies, they've always been concerned about the debt ratio. And so that's the responsibility, not of Adam Perry, who is a highfalutin lawyer at Hodson Russ, who receives an awful lot of money from the city of Buffalo, from the mayor for outside counsel.
Millions in legal
So
work
this
from
must be the
taxpayers.
reason why he's so interested in being involved in the citizens business, I guess. But
Must be why he admonished you and not the mayor, because
because
you
he
want to
can't.
bite the hands that feed
Yeah,
them.
he can't. So it's disappointing, but yet this is what happens, and it will continue to happen. But my observation to Mr. Perry and to the board that he belongs to, and also to the mayor and to the council, it is now time to really refine what you've been doing over the last 4 years or so, because it's not going over real well.
Yeah, and speaking of not going over well, the rating agencies, Standard & Poor, Moody's, and Fitch, they've all said the city's debt is too high as it is now. And you have a policy that reduces the city's debt by never incurring more debt than we expire each year. Now, they're also very concerned about, this is the 8th budget in a row that relies on reserves. They're concerned about that. But they've credited your policy with trying to keep this debt under control. And if it goes out of control, they wouldn't be too happy. And
Yeah. That's why the citizens of Buffalo are fortunate because of this charter. The city charter calls for a separately elected fiscal officer. In most cities, Patrick, in New York State, and even most counties, they don't have that. It's all under the mayor or the county executive. And then they can do whatever they want to do. They can't do whatever they want to do now.
right. And you're just trying to get them to look at the big picture. Now, capital expenses, you're supposed to build something, and a lot of times it's supposed to be something big. Instead of trimming trees and fixing gutters, this should be money that's building something. Down the line, the city might have to build a stadium. They might have to do a new convention center or even a public works campus. Now, it would be a shame if the city were hampered to be able to do that because they borrowed too much money to trim trees and to fix roofs and to tear down houses.
In the proposed legislation in both the House and the Senate that could be signed by the president, it eliminates these tax credits for new stadiums, of which stadiums across the nation have benefited from. They are now taking that out of the playbook. It's no longer going to be something that Buffalo or Erie County is going to be able to use as a benefit like other cities across the nation. That all goes away with this so-called reform tax package presented by the president and by the Republican members of Congress.
All right, Mark, we got less than a minute left over the Thanksgiving break. You joined Mrs. Triggs in a community outreach program?
She's amazing. So Mrs. Triggs, and she has a 501c corporation, a not-for-profit called We Care None Like You. And I've been working with Miss Triggs for about 12 years. And in the beginning, she mostly she's a good deed doer. She helps people, mostly on the east side. But over the last 6 or 7 years, she's been very helpful to all people who are in need on the east side, west side, north side, and on the south side. And over Thanksgiving, she distributed over 3,500 Thanksgiving dinners. We assisted her, myself, Peggy Overdorf, the executive director of the Valley Community Association, my wife, and we distributed many, many dinners to a lot of different organizations around the city of Buffalo.
That's great news. She's doing great work out
She's
there.
good. She's great.
That's all the time we got for Controller's Corner, Mark. Thanks for joining us. And thanks for joining us at home. Make sure to check out the Controller's website, our Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and our Twitter handle. On behalf of Mark Schroeder, this is Pat Curry, signing off.